maybe she's, I think she has joined, or maybe she is not joined. She has not joined some urgent meeting also. But our dean, Dr. Niti Rana, Dean School of Humanities and Social Sciences, Gautam Buddha University, they from various departments of Gautam Buddha University, and learned professors from the various parts of India, scholars from various universities of India, media students, and all participants who have joined this term right now. Friends, we have gathered here to discuss new trends in media research, which is highly debated, discussed, and deliberated upon these days. I am highly honored to take this opportunity on behalf of the Department of Mass Communication and Media Studies and Gautam Buddha University, Greater Noida, Greater Noida State, Uttar Pradesh from India. Beth E. Barnes, I welcome you on behalf of whole India to welcome our today's chief guest, Professor Beth E. Barnes, and all participants who are present here. It's a matter of a great pleasure to inform you that we have amongst a very renowned personality from USA, a very distinguished media professor, media academician, Professor Beth E. Barnes. I think you all are able to hear me? You all are able to hear me?
Yes,
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Professor Barnes is PhD and professor in the Department of Integrated Strategic Communication and Information at the University of Kentucky, USA. She teaches in the Integrated Strategic Communication to media students. She is also active in education abroad, regularly offering courses in Cape Town, South Africa, and London. Professor Beth has previously director of UK's School of Journalism and Telecommunications. Now it is known as Journalism and Media. So she has acted in journalism and mass communication accreditation through the Accrediting Council of Education and Mass Communication. Bernice has worked in media research at DDB Advertising Agency situated in Chicago. She is the author of several textbooks, most recently written Advertising Account Planning, my favorite topic, Bernice. So, account planning, new strategies in the digital landscape with Carol J. Pardon and Sherry J. Royal in this year 2020. She has also written several invited book chapters and been published in Journalism and Mass Communication Educators, Journal of Marketing Communication, Journal of Advertising Education, and so many more. Bernice is a member of the Association for the Education in Journalism and Mass Communication and American Academy of Advertising also. At Kentucky, she serves on the Area Committee for Promotion and Tenure in the Humanities and Arts and the International Advertising Council also. She chairs the Education Award Committee of that council. Professor Beth E.Barnes holds doctoral and master degree from Northern University and bachelor's degree from the College of Williams and Mary. So we are thankful, my dear friend Bernice. We are thankful to her, to your sparing time out of your busy schedule. We were discussing continuously. I always requested Bernice, please spare some time. You are very much important for our students. She always agreed. I am thankful wholeheartedly, Bernice. So she, after her busy schedule, to be a part of this webinar, which is a series designed by our Mass Communication Department of Gautam Buddha University to continue imparting knowledge on issues of pertinence, interest, and utility. Dr. Beth, you will be happy to know that our Gautam Buddha University and Department of Mass Communication and Media Studies always strive to strike a perfect balance between the theory and the practical of the subject. We always try. In this endeavor, we continue to organize seminars, conferences, workshops, media fairs, faculty development programs, media conclaves, and now new addition to this endeavor is webinar and online lecture series also. We run our own YouTube channels, web pages, Facebook pages, which is a very essential activity of every department is there. So, the talk today, the new trends in media research which is going to be discussed in this program, no doubt it's very relevant for all. Relevant for all media professionals, media educators, scholars, and students. As we know, mass media research is the study of information related to any form of mass communication. And new trends in media research revolve around basically 4 dimensions. I think this is my opinion that includes the citizenship engagement, organizational innovation and adaptation, modality and content computerization. In particular, media research that indicates that journalism and other media organizations are innovating or attempting
So, Banana Pandey, we have lost your voice, please. I think there's some technical challenge that Dr. Banana Pandey is facing right now with the audio. I'm sure she will be joining in shortly. the meantime, I just request you to just hold on for a second. Dr. Vandana Pandey is relogging. While she does that, let me jump the gun and may I request Professor Dr. Beth Barnes to please open her remarks, and we would be very glad to listen to you while Dr. Vandana Pandey is also joining the show.
Sure, my pleasure. Hi. Hello, everyone.
Hi.
Good afternoon, all of you. Hi.
Good afternoon and good morning to you.
Thank you. I did say when we were figuring out when this was going to, when would be the best time, that I get up fairly early, so it's fine with me. I'm hoping I'm going to be able to share this. Sorry. Oh. It's not allowing me to share my screen.
You have to present now. You can do that.
Yeah. I'm sorry. I thought I had told it to, and it's not letting me into it. I apologize. Sorry. I don't use Google that often, so.
If you go to the right side,
yeah.
Now.
Okay. Shoot. It's telling me I have to quit to be able to share. So I think what I'll do is instead, with y'all's permission, I will just talk through this. And I have
your presentation, you can share later, and we'll share with you.
Absolutely. I've already sent it to Dr. Pandey. So, but I just did that this morning. Anyway, I completely agree with what Dr. Pandey was saying just a few minutes ago about the range of possibilities in media research. Myself, what I have tended to focus on, I do actually a variety of things, but in terms of media research, my real focus has been primarily on media audiences. And I thought I would give you a little bit more background on myself, some things that actually are not in my bio, but that help to explain sort of how I got interested in media research and particularly media audience research. So Dr. P did mention I did my master's degree at Northwestern University in advertising, and that was very much a practical, professionally focused program. One-year program, very intensive, primarily for students who had done something more general in their undergraduate studies. I was actually an English literature major. But this advertising master's program, one of the courses, not surprisingly, was a course on media planning, to learn about the whole range of media from an advertiser's perspective and what kinds of factors you would look at in making recommendations to clients on where they should be spending their advertising dollars. And then for the capstone project, to finish off that master's degree program, it was a group project, and each group had a different client. And I happened to end up in a group that was working for a magazine in Chicago, but looking at how that magazine could expand what it was doing. And what we ended up coming up with was something actually very much along the lines of some of the very specialized television channels these days. And so that really got me started thinking much more from an audience perspective about what people would be interested in seeing in the media and how they might make use of media content. After that program, I worked for about 4 or 5 years, and then I went back to school to work on my PhD, and back to Northwestern, although in a different college in communications. And in the communication studies program, there was a lot of opportunity to take courses from other departments as well. And very early on, I took a course in radio, television, film on audience analysis. And that course absolutely fascinated me. The person who taught that just retired just within the last few months from Northwestern. but any of you who are interested in audience research in particular may know his name, James Webster. When you do see the presentation, I've got several of his books mentioned in there as things that you might want to take a look at. But he just had a really interesting way of talking about audiences, and the different journal articles that we read for that course, again, were just really fascinating to me. And I'll actually come back to one of them a little bit later in this presentation. And I ended up actually having Dr. Webster as my dissertation advisor, and my dissertation focused on actually trying to disprove something that was in one of the articles that we had read, but really looking at audiences for local radio stations in the U.S., local television stations, and then for national cable television networks. And taking data from Listen Company and reanalyzing, reworking those data to try to answer the research questions that I had. And as I said, that was just, that course on audience analysis really sparked something in me. I haven't gotten to teach in that area at Kentucky, although I remain hopeful. But I did at Penn State University, which is where I taught immediately after my doctoral program. And I also did a couple of special topics courses related to it when I taught at Syracuse University. The one other thing that I was able to do relatively early on in my academic career that really contributed a lot to my interest and really just fascination with audience research was I worked the first summer after I had started teaching at Penn State. I was a faculty media intern with DDD in Chicago, as Dr. Pandy mentioned. This was a program, I actually don't think they have it anymore, but that they would bring in a faculty member from an advertising faculty around the country for 2.5 months in the summer to help work on various projects. And of course, part of that was those projects might then give you ideas for your own research that you continue to do. And that first summer, what I really focused on with them was something that they were pushing very hard for their clients, a concept called personal media network, which looked at people's media use across the day, but tied to the activities they had going on. So really thinking about how media fit into people's lives, and also if they were using it primarily for entertainment, for information, or if it was a background sort of thing. And again, I just thought that was a really, really interesting way to think about media and think about media use. The following summer, one of the media research department members was going on maternity leave, and I was invited to come back and fill in while she was away. Again, we were still doing a lot with personal media network, but another project I remember from that particular summer, which again I just thought was such an interesting approach. One of our clients was one of the major retailers, and they were doing a lot of Sunday newspaper insert advertising. And we were really curious about how effective that advertising was and if people were actually paying attention to it. So the idea was to recruit married couples and have them come in, it's the couple together, and we had both of the previous Sunday's newspapers. Chicago is actually still surprisingly just a 2-newspaper city. So the Chicago Tribune and the Chicago Sun-Times there. We just said, you know, tell us which paper you normally read, and then just show us how you go through the Sunday paper. And to hear them talk about what they looked at, what they didn't look at. Obviously, we asked some more detailed questions about the retail inserts themselves. Anyway, again, just really interesting to hear people talk about how they use media. And in that particular instance, how they used advertising in media to make decisions. So all of those things, you just continue to reinforce for me just this interest that I have continued to have in the role of media. Much more recently than that, I had the opportunity for about 6 years to be working with a media training institute in Zambia, in Southern Africa. And part of our mandate on that, it was primarily around using journalism to reduce stigma around HIV and AIDS with money from the PEPFAR program, which is a big U.S. government funding program around that. But we also had, as part of what we were doing, we were trying to help strengthen the media in Zambia in general. And one of the ways to do that, of course, was to help them get more support from advertisers, so they would need to rely less on the government and other funding agencies who might, influence what kinds of stories they were doing. And so I did a lot of training with the newspaper and radio sales staff, and we talked a lot about audience research and actually working with the Zambia Institute of Marketing to try to institute more robust audience research measures within Zambia in order to attract spending from multinational advertisers. And I'll come back to that a little bit as well towards the end of this. So I know the topic of this is new trends or current trends in media research. I have to say, I don't know that we actually do new things in media research. We always have, I think, the same questions. It's just what we're focused on that will change. And part of that change obviously comes as new media forms arise, without question. Part of it also comes as just new topics emerge. So what I thought I would do, and you'll see when you get the presentation that I have an example article for each of these, is just talk about some of the main topics that I see coming up over and over again. And again, particularly those of you who are thinking about what your own research might look like, I think that there is ample opportunity always for new discovery when it comes to media. So the first thing I just want to mention is the one that in many ways is nearest to my heart, and that's audience measurement. Again, I tend to come at media research very much through an advertising lens, because that's what my initial training was in. And certainly, audience measurement is, I think many times people in the general public don't realize the importance of audience measurement, given that it determines what we actually get to see and hear, right? Because unless you're talking about media that do not rely on advertising for any support, then a great deal of the funding for media outlets comes from their advertising dollars. And those advertising dollars are a direct result of the audience measurement system. And so we are constantly debating which systems make the most sense. I actually saw, in preparing for this, I was looking a little bit at audience measurement in India, and I saw that not too long ago, I think within the last year or so, there was some controversy over a print audience report that came out that people did not agree with. And when you don't agree with the findings, you always blame the research, right? But certainly, that's no unusual thing here in the U.S. as so much money is dependent on, what the most recent Nielsen ratings say about television, for example. And so there's a great deal of research primarily being done by practitioners, but really looking at methods of measuring audiences. Are there ways that we can make it more efficient, less burdensome on the research participants? All of those kinds of questions. I will say, if you're interested in some of the history on this, about how audience measurement systems really do influence media availability and media evolution, actually way back in my doctoral program, one of my fellow students and I did a study on this, and one of the references I have for you in the presentation is a piece that we wrote that was in Journal of Advertising Research that looked at both magazine audience measurement and television measurement in the U.S. and how the measurement systems sort of preceded growth in those types of media. So I personally think, I'm not an economist, but I think the economic side of media research is absolutely fascinating. So that's one area, and again, until the day comes, if it does come, that we all have implants and people will just know what we're watching and reading and listening to, we're going to need audience measurement systems. And so trying to make sure that those systems are as robust as possible, I think will be an important role for both academic researchers and people in the professional community. The second area, and this is the one that I think gets more and more layers added to it all the time, is cross-media or multimedia use. Again, particularly from an advertiser perspective, we know that people don't use just one type of media. We know that increasingly, even at one particular point in time, people aren't using just one type of media, right? There's the whole multi-screen phenomenon. I know I'm often looking at a magazine while I've got the television on, things like that. And so there's been a great deal of study, again, both on the academic side and on the practitioner side, about what this looks like, people's varying levels of attention, how, looking sometimes at particular advertising campaigns to try to hypothesize or map out how the different types of media contributed to the overall effects of that campaign. And so that's one where particularly I think academic researchers who are interested in experimental design as their primary methodology, that's a very fertile area, because again, we just seem to keep getting all these new and additional types of media, new outlets within existing types. And so just trying to puzzle out how those work with each other. I've seen some interesting work recently looking at how traditional media can be used to help drive traffic to social media. And as many brands have put a lot of their spending into social media, that's something important to know, that it doesn't seem like just social media alone is enough. You do still need traditional media to help drive those audiences, but that's something that has come out of some of that cross-media, multimedia research. The third area is, of course, new forms of media, right? Anytime that a new media form emerges, there's a lot of rush, again, both from the professional side, trying to figure out, will this work for advertisers, but also from the academic side, how does this affect people's use of media? And so looking at new forms of media, how those can best be used, how consumers are engaging with those media forms, whether it's a question of people shifting their media use from one form of media to another, or if the overall media use is growing and just being split among more different entities. So that area as well, and you can almost guarantee that probably it's already starting, but I'm sure within the next year or so, we will see a lot of academic journal articles about TikTok, right? And its various uses. That area about new media forms, to me, is very closely related to the next area that I think is another one that it's not being looked at quite as much right now, but I think it still is a very important topic, and that's the whole area of audience segmentation, right? And this is one that I think when you look at it from an advertising point of view, it's one sort of problem, but when you look at it from a policy or a citizenship point of view, it's another kind of problem, right? So again, I'll start with my wheelhouse, advertising. As audiences fragment across more and more types of media, and then within those types of media across more and more options. Dr. Webster, my dissertation advisor, has done a lot looking at audience segmentation in television. It's harder to amass an audience, right? We do still talk in terms of mass communication and mass media, but really, with very, very few exceptions, it's hard to think of examples of a true mass audience anymore, right? One of the courses I teach at Kentucky is about sales promotion and sponsorship. And particularly in talking about sponsorship, we spend a lot of time talking about sport. And sport, particularly world sport events, is one of the few places where you still can even approach what I would consider to be truly a mass audience. But otherwise, excuse me. Well, otherwise, people's interest and attention is spread across so many different options. And so from an advertising perspective, the real issue with media fragmentation is, and again, this ties back into some cross-media, if you're trying to build that fairly robust audience, how many different types of media are you going to have to use? How many different and what mix of vehicles within those media types are you going to have to use? But I think with this particular topic, I think the policy implications are even larger. And I think we're seeing that certainly right now in my country, as far as messaging around coronavirus is concerned. Where do you put messages to try to reach as many people as possible? And where do you put messages to reach a large number of people in an environment that will be considered believable, credible? We have been teaching this summer through our College of Pharmacy an online course on the coronavirus, and I was asked to do a session for them on communication around coronavirus, and so had a chance to look at some of the health ministries around the world and what they're doing. And everybody's got sample messages for social media, which I think is great, but again, people are really fairly fragmented across social media as well. So what do you do there? So, the fragmentation issue, on the one hand, it's great when it comes to consumer choice. You know, we can all find something now, this time, to watch or read or listen to that is what we're interested in. But how do we gather large groups of people? So that's fragmentation. And then, again, somewhat related to that, I think, you know, all of these questions around media research, they all interlace with each other. But related to that is the issue of audience polarization, right? Again, a particularly big problem in my country, especially right now. But the fact that people do have so many choices means that we self-select what we're going to pay attention to, right? And so to the extent that media are partisan, to the extent that media outlets are presenting, you know, a particular take on a story, we can choose what take we want to pay attention to. You know, I certainly know of people who consciously will make an effort to try to look at different outlets to try to see how the same story is being talked about in different places. But of course, for many people, that's not what we do, either because we don't have the time to do that, or, you know, more so because, again, we're going to naturally, I think, gravitate to the outlets that reinforce our own belief system and our own thinking. And again, I mean, advertisers do think some about that because you think about the environment that you want your message to be viewed in or not viewed in. But it's more of an issue, I think, from a policy point of view, from the point of view of thinking about the role of media in helping to foster an educated citizenry. And so how do we deal with polarization? In a lot of the research I've seen on it is more about identifying polarization than really talking about how you deal with it. The example article that I have for you on that is one done by another one of Dr. Webster's doctoral students, looking at news audience polarization in South Korea over time. And so it is a problem in many, many markets, many countries around the world. But again, I think one where particularly academic researchers can have an important role to play to try to think about views on, you know, things that we might do or suggest to try to bring people back together, or at least to mitigate the effects of polarization. Okay. And then the last, as far as issues are concerned, and then I'm going to change this just a little bit, is certainly, you know, topics will come up, circumstances will arise that will lead to people taking a very focused approach in media research. And the two examples of that I would just talk about briefly, one certainly around political communication. So in the US, we are fairly open as far as political advertising is concerned. In fact, it's the only kind of advertising in the US that is not regulated at all. You can't tell, that's a pet peeve of mine. Because what happens, of course, is people see these outrageous political messages and assume that that means that brands can do the same thing, which they absolutely cannot do. But certainly the last probably particularly three or four national election cycles in the US, there's been a great deal of scholarship around particularly how the internet is being used by political candidates. Actually, one of my doctoral students is going to be working on a research study starting in the next month or so, looking at why and how people engage with political candidates on their Facebook pages. And so that is a topic that I think pretty much anywhere in the globe, looking at just how social media is being used in general, but particularly, as I said, around the political issues, I think it's been a big one. And then, of course, and I already alluded to this, right now, there's a lot being done, looked at in terms of how media use is being affected by the current pandemic. Nielsen, in particular, is constantly posting updates about research they're doing about is people's media use changing, both in terms of quantity of media use, and yes, it's going up, and then what types of media they're using. And so, you know, just trying to figure out, again, anytime there's something sort of overarching like that happening, I think we always have questions about what does that mean in terms of how people are using the media, why people are using different types of media, and also how are the media themselves responding to what's going on. And obviously there's had to be a lot of change with that as well. So I think that's something else for media researchers, is to always sort of have an eye open for what the next hot button topic is going to be. And again, I don't know that we do different things, we just ask different questions. So how can we apply the media research toolbox that we already have to this new question or set of questions. So the other things that I wanted to mention are just a couple of, I have these labeled as theories or axioms, and the first two are more axioms, and then I've got one theory to talk about. But the first two of these, again, unless you really are into media audience research, you may not be super familiar with these. But one is the idea of inheritance effects. Again, this is something that Dr. Webster looked at a lot, but inheritance effects is about lead-in. And so, again, something that I think particularly for industry professionals, this is a really important area and question, but also it's been looked at by academic researchers. But really thinking about how audiences flow. So how do they move from one media entity to another? So with television programming, for example, it's something, inheritance effects is something that programmers think about when they decide what order their programs will be shown in. So what do you use to first entice that audience to your particular network? And then what follows after it that hopefully will hold on to most of that audience and maybe build on it. So if you look at the programming strategies, you can really oftentimes see this playing out in terms of the order that programs are being shown in. And you know, some of it certainly is also counter-programming to what's going on other networks at the same time, but a lot of it is really thinking about what type of audience will this particular programming attract, what do I put on after it to hold on to those people, or what do I put on after it to bring in a different audience group. And there's been, if you're interested in modeling, there's a lot of that goes on in the study of inheritance effects. And again, I've given you a reference to an article from 2006 that's a little bit old from Dr. Webster, but what he did I thought was fascinating. He replicated a study he had done 20 years previously, saying, you know, look at everything that's changed in terms of the availability of channels and programming that people have. Is what was the case 20 years ago still the case now? And it turned out, yes, as a matter of fact, it was. So again, the questions, you know, what we're doing doesn't really change. It's just the way that we're tweaking the questions that might. The other one with that is the one that I really was focused on in my dissertation, and it still is something that gets talked about a lot, and it still drives me crazy. So I did want to mention it, and that is something called the Law of Double Jeopardy. Now, if you happen to have a legal background, there's double jeopardy from the legal side. That is not what we're talking about here. The Law of Double Jeopardy, as it applies to media, is something that was really developed very fully by Professor Andrew Ehrenberg and colleagues. And basically what the Law of Double Jeopardy in media says is that, well, it's actually in marketing, not just media, but that anything, whether it's a product, a station, a program that has a relatively small audience, that relatively small audience will also be a less loyal audience. And when we first, in that audience analysis class I mentioned, when we first read this article, I was outraged. And the very first thing I thought of was radio. Again, I realize radio works differently in different parts of the world, but in the US, radio, this has changed a little bit, but radio is still primarily a very local type of media. And radio stations tend to be fairly tightly formatted. So, for example, particularly when I'm driving, I like to listen to country music. And so a country radio station, that's what they do. They play country music. And it just seemed counterintuitive to me that if someone is choosing country music radio, because that is the kind of programming they really enjoy, why wouldn't you necessarily say then, assuming that that station has a relatively small audience, that audience wouldn't be particularly loyal? That just didn't make sense to me. And the work that had originally been done by Ehrenberg and colleagues talking about this, the media work, had been about over-the-air television. And over-the-air television, still today, is a hodgepodge, right? It's all kinds of different programming as you move across the day. It varies also from day to day what kinds of things are being on. I thought, well, okay, maybe in that environment that makes sense, but I don't think that I believe that this law would apply just across the board. So what I had done in my dissertation was I picked several markets. I looked at local radio. I looked at over-the-air television in those markets as well. So I was using Arbitron the Arbitrum company's data for radio, Nielsen for local TV, and then also Nielsen for national cable networks. Because to my way of thinking, at least some cable networks, and again, this was a while ago, it's even more true today. Some cable networks are also, they're like radio stations. They're very, very narrowly programmed, right? And what I found was that my results for local TV were almost identical to what Aaron Berg and colleagues had found. But radio, no, Double Jeopardy did not hold in radio. You would have, as way that I operationalize loyalty with time spent viewing or time spent listening, which again, you can get from the audience research data. Local radio, no. Stations with small audiences, they were not less loyal. In fact, in some cases, they were more loyal. And cable was kind of a mixed bag, but because of the way that cable worked, right? So the cable networks whose programming sort of mimicked the over-the-air broadcast networks, where they had a lot of different kinds of programs, yeah, they looked like broadcast TV. The specialized cable networks looked more like radio. So it made me feel better to know that Double Jeopardy didn't necessarily always apply, but it still is something that gets talked about quite a lot. So that's kind of a pet one of mine, which is why I wanted to mention it. But then the other area, and this is the theory, and if you have done anything in media research, you will know that the dominant theory that gets talked about is uses and gratifications, right? Particularly if you're talking about audiences, without question, without doubt. And that, again, I think goes back to what I was saying at the outset, that the things that we look at and talk about don't really change. The angle we come at it from does, but uses and graphs, absolutely still there. There has been a great deal done just in the last few years looking at uses and gratifications around social media, for example, either social media, broadly speaking, or particular social media platforms. Just any type of media that you can think of. People are coming at that from a perspective of why are people using that type of media, what are they using it for, and then what are they getting from it, or what are they hoping to get from it. And that is one, I can't imagine that ever going away as a focus area. And, uses and gratifications as a theory is really, I think, flexible for researchers because there are a lot of different ways you can approach it methodologically and still be taking a uses and gratifications perspective. Obviously, my doctoral student who I mentioned earlier, that's her underlying theory for what she's going to be looking at about engaging with political candidates on their Facebook pages. So, if you are interested in media research and you haven't already really grounded yourself in uses and gratifications, that's something that you definitely want to do. But I think we still use it because it still works very well for what we look at, right? So sometimes people add new uses, they add new gratifications, but the underlying theory stays the same. Okay. So I do want to talk a little bit about the practitioner side of media research as well. I know when Dr. Pandy and I were talking and setting this up, I asked her, which angle do you want me to come at it from? And she said, oh, please do both, which I'm happy to do because I'm a big proponent for working with industry. And so you'll see when you see the presentation, a quote from actually a really interesting study looking at cross-platform advertising, where the authors basically did a really exhaustive literature review to see who had written about cross-media advertising, where they had published, and what kinds of questions they were trying to answer. And they found a very clear split in the way that practitioners approached topics around cross-media use and the way that academics did. And you will not be surprised to hear that on the academic side, entirely theory-focused, is what we do, right? On the practitioner side, much more about looking at data collection issues, mentioned that before, at data modeling, and also at reach and effect issues across media advertising. Again, much more, as it would be applied, much more practical use. But, we've got these media research companies who are collecting huge amounts of data. And obviously they're using that for their own purposes, they're using it for their clients, and I don't know for sure if this is the case in India, although I would hope it would be. I know here in the US, oftentimes those media research companies are willing to share data with academic researchers. Usually not the most current, but that's okay, for what we're trying to look at and the questions we're trying to answer. If it's a year or 2 years old, that's probably not really that big of a concern. So you'll see when you see the presentation, I just gave you the list of everything that Nielsen in the US lists as their media research solutions. And a lot of it is, purely audience measurement. But there are also, they're looking a lot at segmentation. Again, back to uses and graphs, what kinds of audiences are using different content. They are doing a lot with trying to figure out the best ways to measure people's media use when they're away from their homes. So out of home use, but you'll just see it's quite a long list. But I know that in India, your television audience measurement is coming through the Broadcast Advertising Research Council. I think I'm correct in that. And I found their website really fascinating. First of all, I just want to say, it always makes me both happy, but then also disappointed in the U.S. at how little audience research information we freely share versus other parts of the world. I mentioned working in Zambia, but I also, as Dr. Pandey mentioned, I teach in most years, not this year, in Cape Town, South Africa as well. And the South African Advertising Research Foundation just has a wealth of data and presentations freely available on their website. And from what I was able to see with your Broadcast Advertising Research Council, they're very much in that same vein. They're not, of course, putting out everything, but they've got quite a lot of information. But as a researcher, I was really excited to see how large their sample is. And in fact, they have, at least according to their roadshow, the largest audience measurement panel in the world. And I believe the number I saw was 180,000. Yes, 180,000 individuals. That is just mind-boggling. I mean, if you could even get just a small slice of that to be able to use for your own research, oh my goodness. Think about that, what that would be like. So again, you've got a slide. They do a roadshow presentation around the country periodically, and the 2019 roadshow presentation is on their website. And again, it has just a huge amount of data in it, but also, just some summary statistics on them. And I will also mention that they include on their summary slide the fact that they are a great place to work. So if you're thinking about maybe going the practitioner route rather than the academic route, or doing consulting, they might be people to talk to as well. But I mean, to me, just the type of measurement that they're doing, they have a really interesting approach, which again, you guys are probably familiar with. They have been able to insert watermarks in all the programming, and those cannot be removed. And so with that watermark technology, if you're part of their panel, my understanding is that as long as you have got your panel unit turned on, it's going to automatically capture what you're watching. And they are able to report, which I do not think that Nielsen does, at least not publicly here in the US. They are able to report numbers of impressions for individual advertisements, which I know Nielsen US has the technology to do that, but they found when they first tried to pilot it that agencies weren't interested in buying this data because it was just too much detail. But so I was stunned to see that information there for India. Stunned and fascinated, I have to say. So I think they're doing a lot of really innovative things in terms of measurement beyond just the fact that they've got the largest panel out there. So again, if they are someone who, I don't know if your university already works with them or not, but I definitely think, if not, I think that would be a connection worth exploring. The other then that I was able to find is the Media Research Users Council, which looks to me like the group that is mainly focusing on print media measurement. Again, as I said, this was something that I got particularly interested in while I was working in Zambia, because South Africa has a version of the Audit Bureau of Circulation, the Alliance of Audited Media, excuse me, that produces verified audience numbers for publications there. And I did a little bit of work for a while in Botswana, and the media people there were very envious of the advertising dollars that South Africa was getting, and were very frustrated that they weren't getting what they felt like their share. And we were talking about it, and I did some checking. I said, well, but you don't have audited circulation figures. I mean, everything that you are providing to advertisers is self-reported, and I'm sorry, why would they believe that? They're going to think that you're going to be bumping up your numbers to try to get more money from them. And so we were finding the same thing in Zambia. And so they're still working on it, but as I said, the Zambia Institute of Marketing was going to take the lead on trying to get an audit system set up there. But in India, it already exists, although this is the one, as I said, I think 2 years ago, there was some controversy over what the numbers look like. But it is the Indian Readership Survey that they do, covering more than 600 different publications. They're also doing a little bit of cross-media work. I saw some radio information on there as well. And they, interestingly, are using Nielsen to do, Nielsen India is their provider who is doing the implementation of that for them. They were working with somebody else up until a couple of years ago. I think maybe up until there was that little ruffle about the data, but they're now working with Nielsen on that. So, again, as a media research person, the fact that you have what looked to me at least like robust audience measurement services in place in India is great news, because I think if you're not already partnering with those organizations, it's definitely worth approaching them to see if they would be willing to give you access to data. Because there are so many questions that we as academic researchers can answer that aren't with their data, that aren't necessarily of interest to them, that they're not going to take the time to do themselves. But the answers are within those data. And so if we can get access to those data and look at them through our audience media research eyes, I think it offers lots of great possibilities. As I said, I wouldn't have been able to do my dissertation if Nielsen hadn't been willing to share some of the data that they did. So to summarize, and then I'm happy to answer any questions you have, as I said, the types of media that are out there and the individual vehicles within those media, that's constantly changing, right? It's also the case that media research drives major economic decision-making. I mean, so much money is tied up. And again, on the Indian audience research side, they talk about the huge amount of money that's at stake with all of this. And then also, trying to figure out why people do what they do, I just find that fascinating. I think it's what got me interested in advertising in the first place, how I shifted from English literature over to advertising. Those questions about why do people do that? And so, knowing those three things, the media world's always changing, there's a lot of money involved, and it lets us really think about why people behave the way they do. I think there's always going to be a role for media research. And I know when I talk to my graduate students and they've got multiple interests in trying to decide an area of focus, I always put at least a little pitch in there for media research. There's probably something in there that might catch your attention and that would, that you could help to explore more fully. So I hope that does give you a few things to think about. And as I said, I am happy to answer any questions. Dr. Pandy has my presentation, so she can hopefully figure out a way to share that with all of you. I do love technology that, you think you can do something and then you can't, but we go with the flow, right? But anyway.
Thank you so much, Dr. Barnes. Indeed thought-provoking, and you covered a lot of aspects in just a short period of time, and I'm sure all of us have, I won't use the word to be a bubble, but there's a lot to go back into the recording. I'm sure all of us will look back into this recording and note down the points that we may have to study, whether it is the theoretical part of double jeopardy. It's a very interesting theory that you put up for us, for your understanding of the practice of the media fragmentation and research that's happening across the globe. I must say, your examples were from US, from Africa, from India. Indeed, I must say all of us are very happy. In fact, if I read some of the comments, it's really gratifying comments. And US gratification still after 50 years, still there. So some very good comments. Thank you so much for such an amazing and insightful lecture, thought-provoking lecture, very, very relevant. So yes, I'm sure the audience is loving this. And we have some questions coming up. And I would also request if Dr. Padana Pandey ma'am is hearing us, if she can join in, because she left midway because of some technical issues, and she also has a question to ask. So if Dr. Pandey is here, if you can ask this question.
No, I don't have a kind of question. Just inquiring to Varney, what's the status of the print media during the pandemic in USA, particularly? Because India is facing so many problems around the print media.
Yeah, Now, I'm going to say first, anything I'm going to say is anecdotal because I haven't looked specifically. My expectation would be that magazine readership is probably up some because with people spending more time at home, I wouldn't be surprised if that's the case. Newspaper websites, I think, are getting more traffic than they had been. Print newspapers, not quite so sure about that. One of the interesting things that has happened here, and I would be curious to know if this is also the case in India, is most of our newspapers are making any content that has to do with coronavirus free. So you don't have to be a subscriber to access it on their website. I know the Washington Post is doing that. The local newspaper in Lexington, where I am, is doing that. I know other papers around the country are doing that. And whether that's something that will entice readers back to newspapers, you know, by letting them have content for free, if they will then see the value and be willing to pay for that content going forward, I don't know. You know, the former journalism school director in me can only hope that that will be the case. But I haven't seen, I've seen a lot, Nielsen's talked a lot about TV, and that TV watching is going up. But because they're the ones I've seen most active currently monitoring media usage. You know what, I'll check and see if Pew has done anything, because they're the other ones who might have something relatively recent. The Pew Research organization here in the U.S. does a lot on media use. So.
Okay, nice.
Thank you for answering that. We still have
Gautam, you can ask some other questions.
Yes.
Yeah, it's a question about
question.
Yeah, yeah.
Yes, you can read the question.
Mr. Vimal Mohan is back, and he is working in NDTV News channel also. He is PhD scholar. He has raised some question. Vimal, you can ask the question. Hello, Vimal. Vimal, are you listening me? Are you hearing me?
I think Dr. Beth can read the question. It's already in the chat box. So if Dr. Barnes, you can answer this question.
So polarization of audiences. Yeah, so I would think, and saying, you know, does it apply in India as well, and it varies due to different TV habits? Yeah, I would think, you know, I think that polarization is happening. Polarization tends to happen anytime you have different media outlets who are taking a different either policy stance, political stance, advocacy stance around issues. So what gets talked about the most in the U.S. is the contrast between Fox News and CNN, where Fox is much more, perceived at least as being much more Republican and conservative, and CNN is seen as being much more liberal and Democrat, right? And there are constant discussions about, you know, the way that they're covering, sorry, I'm doing this because it is always confrontational, the way that they're covering different stories, particularly at the moment, the way they're covering our president. But I think that, you know, where the polarization happens is when people have choices, and further, when there are some clear differences between those choices. And then people are choosing where they're going to spend their time. And even choosing, we haven't had this recently, but, you know, let's say that there was going to be a nationally televised address by the president, and it's going to be carried across multiple channels. So even the choice of which channel you're going to watch, what network you're going to watch that on, would be somewhat affected by polarization, because there's going to be obviously lead-ins from the commentators on that network before the presentation, and then there's going to be analysis afterwards. And so whose lead-in and whose analysis do you want to hear? Right? Even if multiple people are hearing that address, then the spin around that address is going to be different depending on which network. So I would think that anywhere that there are differences in terms of the philosophical underpinnings of the different media outlets, I think you would see polarization happening. Very much so.
Yes, thank you for answering that. And you can see there's another question from Shalini Sharma.
Yes. So the roots of media and communication research are found in traditional academic disciplines, yes, because we don't have our own stuff, right? We borrow from other people. But the fact is that they still affect methodologies, theories, and perspective in media research. So how can one cope with this? That's a really good question. You know, I think first of all, it's important always when you are developing a study and when you are drawing from other disciplines, particularly if your theory base is coming out of other disciplines, to just be aware of what some of the, I don't want to say biases necessarily, but some of the underlying thinking is from another discipline, and to think about yourself how that might be different in a media research environment. You know, we are developing more and more our own theories out of communication, but I think it's just really being very well grounded in what you were drawing on from other disciplines. I do think, and it's maybe one of the reasons that we still are struggling, maybe too harsh a word, but while we're still trying to figure out sort of best practices for audience measurement, for example, because audience measurement isn't necessarily something that other disciplines care about, right? So it's really been left to us as communications people, whether on the academic side or the practitioner side, to try to sort through all of this. And that's why, really, it's one of the reasons I found this hallmarking system that's being used in India for television so fascinating, because I do not believe that, I don't think I've heard about that in other parts of the world. I do know, this is going to be a little bit of a digression, but I hope it's somewhat relevant. I do know that Sky TV is doing a lot with personalized delivery of commercials to audiences. They can put down, I don't know that they can quite do individual households yet, but I have a friend who works with Sky in the United Kingdom, and he's told me about this. I know they can get down to very, very, very small units. And I believe it was on the Indian site that I saw something about they have a way that you can target just affluent households with your messages. But again, you know, so these are not things that other disciplines would really care about, but they're things that we very well might. And so I think that does leave some opportunities for us to say, you know, in some cases, yes, psychology, sociology, those are areas that can really help to inform a lot of what we do in communication, particularly using graph, right, through psychology. But there are some questions that we really will have to come up with our own approaches to that. And so again, it's not easy work to do necessarily, but I think it can be very useful and very fulfilling. I don't feel like I really answered your question, but I hope that at least there's some more thinking around it. But I do know that that is something that definitely, I think, continues to give us tips sometimes in media research and communication research. Let's see. And then I learned about Q methodology. So can I start from line on Q methodology and media research? I really like Q. I did some work with Q methodology when I was at Syracuse, actually with a colleague who was in broadcast journalism, and we were looking at the issue of whether or not advertising influences news media content. You know, basically thinking about advertisers putting pressure on stations to either, on news media to either cover stories or not cover stories. And we used Q as our approach. And so we had a series of statements. So if you're not familiar with Q, you'll have a series of prompts of some sort. I've seen it done with product logos. I've seen it, in our case, we had opinion statements around news media influence. And you have people sort them, individuals, sort those on a continuum from agree with most strongly, disagree with most strongly, whatever your points are. Always an odd number of points on your continuum. And